Welcome to our Friday video. Make sure you watch through at the end because at the end there's going to be a chance for some extra credit. So there's your incentive to follow along for a few minutes here while we kind of summarize and wrap up what we've talked about with monopolies. So we've been talking about how in an extreme form there can be one firm supplying the entire market for a product, and we call that a monopoly. So we see these monopolies when there are barriers to entry, something that prevents other competitors from coming into the market. And so that could be a legal barrier to entry. So with something like a patent, a company has a legal right to exclude others from using this idea that they've come up with. So that would be a legal barrier to entry, creating a monopoly for a branded prescription drug or vaccine or something like that. Now, we'll talk about why monopolies we tend to think of as inefficient. Why do we offer a monopoly, a legal monopoly, to a company and then use the power of the government and the courts and things to enforce that monopoly for them? Well, with something like prescription drugs or vaccines, you could think about if we give this offer of a legal monopoly for a set period of time, maybe 20 years, then that gives them a really strong incentive to come up with new ideas, to innovate, to invest in research and development, to be able to come up with these new drugs, knowing that if they come up with something that is useful to people, that it's safe and effective for treating something, then they'll be able to get this stream of nice monopoly profits for several years while that patent is in term. Once the patent expires, then generic manufacturers can start making that drug, and that big source of revenue will dry up for the company that came up with the drug, but the patent term was long enough for them to have this big reward for coming up with this nice new idea. And so the reason to give that legal monopoly is to create the incentive to make people to want to invent things, to invest. And that goes for patents, wanting new inventions, new ideas. That also goes for people putting energy into new creative expressions. And that's what the body of copyright law within intellectual property is about. So there's why we often offer legal protections in the modern days. The other big source of barrier to entry creating monopolies are market conditions. So in some markets, it really only makes sense to have one firm be the supplier. And so we see that when there's a high fixed cost and very low marginal cost for adding people. We often think of utilities as fitting into this category. It doesn't make sense to run multiple systems of natural gas pipes under the ground. It makes sense to run one and have everyone get their natural gas from this one utility provider. And so that's why we have natural monopolies with things like utilities. Now, it's often kind of a fuzzy line. So you think of like a small town that only has one bank or one taxi cab. Are they a monopoly? In a sense, yes, because they're the only business supplying that market. If we define the market as that little town providing financial services or transportation. But it's often gray areas, right? So a lot of times if people don't like that bank for whatever reason, they may use a bank that's in the next county over. Probably not that big a deal, especially these days when you can do a lot of stuff on mobile banking. You don't need to physically walk into the bank very often. You don't necessarily need to have your bank right down the road from you. Now with a taxi cab, you're probably not going to use a taxi from the next town over because it would be really expensive. But there are other modes of transportation, right? So those are two different dimensions, both geographic and alternative substitute product sort of dimensions that can make it tricky to figure out exactly what a market is to determine if there's actually a monopoly or not. Now, usually we're not thinking of a monopoly as one firm supplying everything. A patent is a good example of when that's pretty true. But very often we're talking about market power, people who have enough of the market to be able to act kind of like a monopoly. And so that's where we get into stuff with, say, the tech companies, with Microsoft having a lot of market power when it comes to operating systems for personal computers, with Windows being such a big player. Google having a lot of market power when it comes to advertising and search. Facebook having market power when it comes to social media networks, especially with older people my age and older. So market power is talking about having a large enough part of a market that you may not technically be a monopoly. You're not the only one, but you have enough of the market that you can act a bit like a monopoly. So that's what we are often seeing in the real world. Again, we use kind of an extreme form of it, a pure monopoly, when we talk about the theory. But we know that what we see in the real world is not quite so extreme usually, but a lot of the same principles do apply. And so one of the important things I want to tie us back to, so monopolies, what do? They set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. They are looking at, so I'm going to put price and quantity on some axes, just like we almost always do, right? So what do these things look like for a monopoly? Well, they're not facing a horizontal demand curve. They're facing the market demand curve. So unlike a firm in perfect competition, monopolies have this aspect of, well, if I want to sell more, if I want to move further out on quantity, it means I'm going to have to lower my price, right? So there's a trade-off for them. If they want to sell more products, it means they need to drop prices, and that applies not just to that one additional unit, it applies to all the other units that they're selling. And that's why we see monopolies not wanting to go with a really low price. And so in fact we can come up with what their marginal revenue curve looks like, the amount that they get from selling an additional unit. It actually looks like this. It's steeper, it's twice as steep as the demand curve, and it's below the demand curve. And so this means as you sell more units, your marginal revenue is dropping faster than the demand curve is. And it means if you go anywhere past here, then you're actually in negative marginal revenue territory. That means that you're bringing in less money by selling more units. Why is that? It's because you had to drop your price enough to sell those last units that you're actually bringing in less money total. And so monopolies never want to be there. It always costs something to make the stuff that you're selling. It may be very small, it may even be close to zero, but it's something. And so you don't want to spend more to make more to only bring in less money. So monopolies are always going to be operating in this zone where the marginal revenue is positive, even if it's approaching zero. Now, where exactly do they want to operate to get as much money as possible? Well, that depends on their marginal revenue curve. And their marginal revenue curve we think of as usually eventually going up with diminishing marginal returns, right? So they're going to pick the spot where the marginal, it's the marginal cost curve, apologies. Can't be where the marginal revenue curve costs the marginal revenue curve. It is where the marginal revenue curve crosses the marginal cost curve. Right here, that's going to tell us how much the monopoly wants to sell. That's the QM. And so how much are they going to charge? We're going to go up to the demand curve to see that. And that gives us PM. And so we can compare that with a perfectly competitive firm is going to be operating, well, a perfectly competitive market is going to have a much higher quantity and a lower price. A monopoly is going to have a lower quantity and a higher price. And they do that, they scale back the amount they sell because it supports a high price in the market, and they have fewer costs of making a lot of stuff, and that's when they end up with this nice zone of profits. And so we can approximate it by looking at this rectangle there as profits. I'm saying approximate it because actually what we would want to use is the average cost curve, not the marginal cost curve. but it's going to be somewhere over here. And so they're going to be paying money to make the stuff that they make and sell, and they're going to have profits coming in. And so that big block of monopoly profits, that's what motivates Pfizer to really want to create a COVID vaccine, right? Because they see this potential for a stream of monopoly profits for 20 years while the vaccine is on patent, and that looks really good to them. Now, if we go back to our classic supply and demand, so our classic supply and demand is assuming something like perfect competition. So when we have this supply demand, we all know that we talk about an equilibrium there, right? And so there's a price and a quantity supported in that market in equilibrium. Now what monopolies are doing, we saw that they are scaling back the quantity so that they have a higher price. So they're somewhere up here. Now let's think about what this does for efficiency in the market. So we like to think of efficiency as something along the lines of getting as much surplus as we can as possible. So in a perfectly competitive market, we have producer surplus, and we know that's this rectangle, this triangle, excuse me, right here. Producer surplus, below the price, above the supply curve. The firms are spending this much to make what they're selling, and they're bringing in this much in profits. There's consumer surplus, that's the area below the demand curve and above the price. So that's the difference between what they'd be willing to pay and what they actually have to pay. There's our consumer surplus triangle in a perfectly competitive market. Now, I'm going to superimpose on this what things look like if we're in a monopoly. The consumer surplus is below the demand curve and above the market price. Well, the market price for a monopoly is high, so we have just this little area of consumer surplus. Now, what do we have for producer surplus? We have a pretty sizable, because not only do we have the area we used to have, since we have a high price, it goes way higher. It goes all the way up to here. So our producer surplus is quite big in a monopoly. Our consumer surplus is really small. So that's why we regulate monopolies. We don't necessarily care that a company is making money, that it's got this nice stream of profits by having market power. That in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. The bad thing about monopolies is by scaling back quantity, by having high prices, they are reducing consumer surplus in a big way. And so we tend to think of that as inefficient. That is definitely detrimental to consumers. We can talk about a deadweight loss area. All of this triangle here that used to be surplus someone was getting, no one is getting now because we've scaled back. We're not making as much stuff. There aren't as many transactions in the market. So monopolies are bad. Market power is bad because it has this effect of reducing quantity, increasing price in ways that are bad for consumer. We lose out on a lot of consumer surplus. We create deadweight loss. So that is why we regulate monopolies. And so local utilities, they have to go through this rate-making process with public utility commissions at the state level, approving of any price change that they have. We're trying to make them have prices that are much more similar to what it would be if they were in a competitive market, even though they're not. With things like the big tech companies, we use antitrust law to sue them or threaten to sue them if they have a bunch of market power and act in ways that stifle competition. If they do things that, if we see prices rising. So that's a big issue with a lot of the tech companies. So traditionally, antitrust regulators who are policing the markets, making sure there's not anti-competitive behavior, the closest thing they could watch would be prices, because that's something you can actually see, right? You look at the prices a company is charging. And if, think of back in the day with railroads and steel and kind of the robber baron era, the Gilded Age, antitrust, the regulators could look at prices that were being charged, and they could look for things like predatory pricing. They could look for prices going up after there was market consolidation. So there's a big merger, and now there's more market power for this firm, and after a little while they raise their prices. That would be this sign that we're losing out on consumer surplus, and antitrust regulators would want to step in. It's been a lot harder for them to do that. They've been trying to come up with new tools, new ways of thinking about this when it comes to the tech companies, because we don't see a lot of prices for the consumer in the same way. How much do you pay for Facebook? Well, you don't have to pay to create an account, right? How much do you pay to do a Google search? Well, we don't have to pay to do a Google search. So a lot of these tech companies are providing services to consumers where the consumers are paying an effective price, well, a nominal price of zero. There are actual costs to it. But setting that aside, it's a lot harder for regulators to just watch the prices that consumers are being charged. So instead, they have to get creative, and frankly, they're still trying to figure out how to effectively approach this issue of market power within the tech companies. So I promised an extra credit opportunity, so here it is. Send me an email and try to do it before Monday. So sometime today, tomorrow, over the weekend, send an email to jacob.bile@WKU and tell me in one sentence, why do we offer a monopoly to Pfizer or any other drug company if they come up with a COVID vaccine? Why do we offer that to them? We've just talked about how monopolies are inefficient. So monopolies reduce consumer surplus by scaling back quantity and raising prices. You can think about that being the opposite of what we want to do right now. So are we able to read this, or is this backwards? We'll find out. So you're emailing me and you're saying, why do we offer a monopoly to Pfizer or any other drug company that comes up with a safe and effective COVID vaccine? We just talked about how monopolies reduce consumer surplus by scaling back quantity and raising prices. Those are the opposite of what we want to do right now with the COVID vaccine, right? With a COVID vaccine, we want to get quantity as high as possible, and we want the price to be effectively zero for people, because we want everyone who wants this to be able to take it. So that's the opposite of how a monopoly acts. So why are we offering a monopoly in the form of a patent to Pfizer if they come up with a COVID vaccine? You will have heard the answer earlier in this lecture, so if you're not sure, if you're really puzzled by it, go back and listen to the first 10 minutes and send me an email with a sentence sometime this weekend. All right. Thank you, guys. Do be safe. While we're talking about COVID stuff, numbers are going in the wrong direction, right? And we have one more week of in-person classes before you guys head, many of you, back home to celebrate Thanksgiving with family. It's a really important time to be careful, because if you're exposed to COVID right now, you're likely to get it and have a really mild case. You may not even know you have it. You may be asymptomatic. And then a week from now, you go home and see your family, and a lot of them are much more likely to get a serious case of it. So that is the worst case scenario, is you guys getting COVID and taking it home and spreading it to a bunch of people. So now is a really important time to be careful, mask up, social distance, on campus and off campus. Be safe for me, okay? I care about you guys. I care about your families. So think about that as you go through the next week. I'll see you next week.